Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Bob Long. As you guys know, these videos are intended for use by students who are enrolled in my Human Anatomy and Physiology course. Anyone else out there finds them helpful, great, but know that they're designed for my students, for my exams, and the level of detail and the topics I cover are in the way that I cover them. If you have a different instructor, either at Del Mar or another institution, it may be a little bit different order, different emphasis here or there. Got it? All right, so now listen. The first video on the endocrine system, we covered sort of the definitions, the overall view of the endocrine system and how it compares to the nervous system. And then I did membrane receptors, intracellular and intranuclear receptors. Now this video is going to do another bit of an overview, and then we're going to start getting into specific hormones. Now, there are 4 different pathways or modalities that hormones can follow in order to go from the target where we detect the stimulus, from the endocrine organ where we detect the stimulus all the way down to the target. I'm going to draw that out for you. And then as we go through each individual hormone, we're going to plug them into one of these 4 pathways. Just follow along, hopefully it'll make sense. So now, I'm going to draw sort of a general layout of parts of the body. Here's the human brain. There's an area in the brain called the thalamus. I'll put a little T for thalamus. Below that is a triangular area called the hypothalamus. Hanging off of that is an infundibulum and a pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is also called the hypophysis. Now, I'm not going to draw the spinal cord in this drawing. Well, actually I will, but I don't need to. Spinal cord hanging off. Now there's 3 of the pathways that we're going to follow. We're going to utilize this same picture to illustrate something. So now, one of the pathways that hormones can follow in order to get from the endocrine organ to the target cell is this. We have 3 different types of endocrine reflexes. There's actually 4, but 3 for this drawing. One is called a simple endocrine reflex. Okay? When I talk about simple endocrine responses or simple endocrine reflexes, what you need to know is this. Somewhere in the body, we're going to have some kind of stimulus. Some kind of change, right? And that stimulus is detected by a group of cells. When the stimulus is detected, this group of cells that detects the stimulus will respond by releasing a substance called a hormone. Remember from the first video, that's my abbreviation for the word hormone, an H and an R combined. That hormone is going to travel through our bloodstream to some distant organ. And as it travels through the bloodstream, it will exit the bloodstream at capillary beds. In most locations, the only cells that will respond will be the cells that have the appropriate receptor. Now, as discussed in the last video, sometimes the receptor's inside the cell or inside the nucleus. I'm going to draw membrane receptors for ease of understanding for now. So we would call this the target organ or the target cell. And those cells are going to give us some kind of response. Or we will say they elicit a response. They give some kind of response, some change. So we call this a simple endocrine reflex because it's real simple. There's one endocrine organ, there's one hormone, there's a target, and there's a response. And if you notice, this endocrine organ, this group of cells, has nothing to do with the nervous system. This group of cells can be in the pancreas, they can be in other areas of the body, the parathyroid glands or whatever. We're going to go over the simple endocrine reflexes. When I do the simple endocrine reflexes, we're going to plug hormones into this picture. Okay? A second pathway that hormones can follow to get to their target cell is called the neuroendocrine reflex. So in a neuroendocrine reflex, they always involve the hypothalamus plus the posterior pituitary. I'm just going to write the words I'll abbreviate posterior, but I'll put posterior pituitary. So essentially what happens in this situation is this. I'm actually going to draw this part of the brain a little bit bigger, okay? I'm not going to draw the whole brain, but this little area from the hypothalamus comes down like this. It's actually sort of a wedge-shaped area. It's got a little group of cells hanging off. This would be anterior, and this would be posterior, according to this drawing. In neuroendocrine reflexes, The cells that detect the stimulus live in the hypothalamus. There are particular nuclei or groups of cells that live in the hypothalamus. But each one of these cells will send axons through the infundibulum into the posterior pituitary. That's why the posterior pituitary is often called the neurohypophysis. Okay? The word hypophysis means pituitary. The neurohypophysis is the posterior pituitary because it has the axons of neurons in it. Those neurons will detect some kind of change called a stimulus. They will release a hormone into the bloodstream at the posterior pituitary. So in a neuroendocrine reflex, the cells that are detecting the stimulus live in the hypothalamus. They would send their axons into the posterior pituitary, release the hormone, and then the hormone would go and bind to a target. In this situation, if I were going to enlarge this, the hormone would travel through our bloodstream. It would exit the bloodstream, bind to some target cells somewhere in the body, and that's where we're going to get our response. And what we're going to learn is, for a specific hormone, what is the stimulus? What nucleus in the hypothalamus sends axons into the posterior pituitary and releases that hormone? Where in the body is the target for the hormone? And what is the response? Okay? If you look at these two, they're very similar in that they involved one hormone. The difference is the endocrine organ is found somewhere else in the body. We call this structure the endocrine organ. The endocrine organ is not in the brain. The endocrine organ itself detects the stimulus, releases a hormone. The hormone goes through the bloodstream, binds to a target cell, and gives us a response. In a neuroendocrine reflex, the endocrine organ is a group of cells, a particular nucleus in the hypothalamus that detects the stimulus. The cells release the hormone at the posterior pituitary or neurohypophysis. It travels through the bloodstream, binds to target cells, and those target cells will give us the response. They're very similar, only one involves no brain, the other one does involve the brain, but the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. Got it? Now, I'm going to erase this because, I'll try to leave this, but I really need to erase it and redraw it so that you guys can see what I'm talking about. We can see the different pathways side by side. So let me erase this. And I'm going to redraw this, and I'm going to redraw both these responses. I'm going to redraw that one, and I'm going to draw another one. So, same image, but here's our hypothalamus. Here's our infundibulum, and here's the pituitary. I'm going to enlarge the pituitary. If this is posterior, or neurohypophysis, and this is anterior, how the posterior and anterior pituitary handle hormones is different. In the posterior pituitary, the neurons live in the hypothalamus and they release the hormone into the bloodstream at the posterior pituitary. That hormone will go to target cells and the target cells will give us the response. Okay? Sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Now we've already seen this. I'm just going to put the blood vessel in. Now, the way the anterior pituitary works is the anterior pituitary is sometimes referred to, here, let me redo this. It's getting a little messy. Sorry, I didn't plan this one out. I've given this lecture 1,000 times and I never plan it. The anterior pituitary is also called the adenohypophysis or adenohypophysis. Adeno means gland, and the anterior pituitary acts like a gland. Here's how it works. There's some stimulus detected in the hypothalamus by a group of cells. This group of cells are not neurons with axons. That group of cells is going to release a hormone, They release a hormone into the bloodstream. That hormone is going to travel through the infundibulum and pop out of the bloodstream at the anterior pituitary. That hormone is going to bind to a second group of cells. That group of cells, when they receive that hormone, again, I'm doing membrane receptors, not always the case, although usually in the anterior pituitary it is. then they will release a second hormone. Now that hormone can follow one of two pathways. That hormone could either A, go directly to a target, and it will do that in some instances. It'll pop out of the bloodstream. It'll bind to some other cells that we call the target cells. And the target cells will give us a response. Okay? So we have a common theme here. We have an endocrine organ somewhere in the body releasing a hormone, binding to target cells. The target cells give us the response. The difference is this. In a simple endocrine pathway, we don't even involve the brain, the hypothalamus, or the pituitary. The endocrine organ is somewhere in the body. It can detect the change, release a hormone. Hormone binds to receptors, gives us the response. In the neurohypophysis or posterior pituitary, some cells in a nucleus in the hypothalamus detect the stimulus. They send axons through the infundibulum into the posterior pituitary, and they release the hormone there. Still one hormone. Goes through the bloodstream, binds to the target cells, and gives us the response. But in what we call a complex endocrine pathway, when we talk about complex endocrine pathways always involve the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So anytime I talk about a complex endocrine pathway or endocrine reflex, they involve the hypothalamus plus the anterior pituitary. Okay? And what happens is, if I could enlarge this, one group of cells releases a hormone. That hormone is almost always going to be called something releasing hormone. And the reason we call this a releasing hormone is because the releasing hormone will cause cells in the anterior pituitary to release what we call a tropic hormone. So I'm going to write these words on here. I wish I had a bigger board. I really do, because I can't fit everything I want onto these pictures. But this particular hormone up here is usually going to be called something RH, which means something releasing hormone. When we get to the anterior pituitary, this hormone is usually called a tropic hormone or tropic hormone, because it's going to have some tropic effect on a distant group of cells, usually the target. Okay? So now, it's complex because it involves multiple steps. The stimulus is detected in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases a releasing hormone. The releasing hormone binds to cells in the anterior pituitary. It acts like a gland or adenoid and releases a tropic hormone. Sometimes that tropic hormone will go directly to a target cell and give us the response. But there's two hormones in the pathway, not just one. These are simple because they don't involve the hypothalamus or the brain. Complex endocrine reflexes involve the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary and at least two hormones, a releasing hormone and a tropic hormone. Neuroendocrine reflexes involve the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. There's still only one hormone. I hope you see that. It's hard for me to try to put it into words, but now there is one other way that this can work. There are some instances where the tropic hormone actually goes to a different endocrine organ, and then that endocrine organ will be, that target organ, This, in some instances, the tropic hormone goes directly to the target. In some instances, the tropic hormone binds to another group of cells, and they're going to release a third hormone in the pathway, and then that hormone will eventually go to the target cells and give us the response. This is why these are called complex endocrine pathways. They involve multiple hormones. Some of the ones we're going to look at are going to involve two hormones, a releasing hormone and a tropic hormone. Others are going to involve three hormones. They'll follow this pathway. Stimulus, hypothalamus releases a releasing hormone. The anterior pituitary will release a tropic hormone. The tropic hormone goes to another endocrine organ, and that endocrine organ will release a third hormone. The third hormone will then bind to the target cells, and the target cells give us a response. Now this gets really confusing for students, but I'm going to draw into one of these drawings again as we go through a series of hormones. But I want you to see them side by side. Simple endocrine reflexes don't involve the hypothalamus or pituitary at all. the endocrine organ is some organ in the body. We'll determine which organ it is when we go over specific hormones. That endocrine organ detects a stimulus, releases a hormone. Hormone goes to the target, gives us the response. Neuroendocrine pathways, the hypothalamus detects the stimulus, but those cells send axons and release the hormone at the posterior pituitary. It goes directly to the target, one hormone, and then that target cells give us the response. But complex endocrine pathways involve the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus detects the stimulus, releases a releasing hormone. The releasing hormone will go through a special group of blood vessels. That group of blood vessels happens to be called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. We'll talk about it in more detail later. That hormone, the releasing hormone, will cause some cells in the anterior pituitary to release a tropic hormone. And then from there, the tropic hormone, for some pathways, will go directly to the target and give us a response. And in other systems, it'll go directly to an endocrine organ. That endocrine organ releases a third hormone, which then goes to the target. So this is an either or, depending on which hormone we're talking about. I think you'll see what I'm talking about when I do these, okay? So you can see how there's three different pathways so far, okay? Simple, complex, and posterior pituitary, neuroendocrine and posterior pituitary, complex and anterior pituitary. Got it? Now, there's one more pathway, and then I'm going to actually start plugging some hormones in. We're actually going to do one hormone here. I'm going to erase all of this. I hope you have that image in your head. I hope you have it in your notes. I'll leave that up. There's one more called direct endocrine reflexes, or a direct endocrine response. Okay? Here's your brain. Somewhere in the brain we detect the stimulus. The stimulus in this instance is going to be stress of some sort. Okay? So somehow our brain detects this. We could see something bad happening. You could see a bear jump out at you at the woods, or a snake jump out and try to bite you. You find a snake in your laundry. You almost have a wreck. Someone scares you. You have some kind of fight or flight response, right? Now, here's one thing that happens, okay? I am actually going to have to erase this. I'm going to try not to. So look, when we have the fight or flight response, in our body, our pupils will dilate and get really big. If I go down to my mouth, then the release of saliva, your mouth dries up. We stop digestive function. Okay? If I go to the further down in the body, like our pits and our palms, we start sweating like crazy. Your heart rate is going to increase. Your breathing rate is going to increase. And all your digestive and reproductive function is going to shut down. So, also, my kidneys, which are going to make urine, are going to shut down. Okay? So look, when I get stressed, we can release a neurotransmitter in the body called adrenaline or norepinephrine. The only hormone that utilizes this system is a compound that can function as a hormone or as a neurotransmitter, okay? So, So, when I get stressed, I can have neurons from some part of the body release adrenaline or norepinephrine on my eyeballs. I have another group of neurons that can go to the mouth and release adrenaline and stop salivation. I have to have another set of neurons go to the heart, and another set of neurons go to the armpits, another set of neurons go to the lungs, and another set of neurons go all the way down here to the kidneys, and another neuron go through the spinal cord all the way down to the digestive system and to the end. I've got all these neurons. When we look at these little tiny synaptic knobs, there's only so many vesicles and so much adrenaline that can be held and released. If the stress lasts a long period of time, these cells will burn out on their epinephrine release, okay, or their norepinephrine. Now, that's when we use epinephrine as a neurotransmitter, or norepinephrine. It's traveling through the spinal cord to all these targets. Imagine this, okay? I am going to erase this after all. I was trying not to, but normally I do this on a long board and I can put them all next to each other. Imagine this exact same thing. So here's the brain, but now I'm going to have what's called prolonged stress. I'm not talking like you almost had a wreck or you saw a snake and you got to run. I'm talking about you work at a job that you hate, your boss is a jerk, you're going through a tough time, a relationship's ending, you've lost somebody and you've been down and out for weeks and weeks and weeks. I'm talking about days and weeks and months of stress, okay? In prolonged stress, rather than burning out all of these organs, having axons synapsing directly on each one of them eventually through a series of steps, what if my brain can send neurons down the spinal cord, and then neurons from there will be synapsing on an area of a gland. So these are your kidneys. I'll put a little K for kidney. The kidneys are called renal organs. Sitting on top of your kidneys are these organs called adrenal glands. Or our book likes to use the term suprarenal organ. I don't like the term suprarenal organ. I like to use the term adrenal gland. And the middle part, the adrenal glands, sitting on top of our kidneys here, would be called the medulla. If you learn from the model in lab, we have the adrenal cortex, but the middle of the adrenal gland is called the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla has a bunch of cells, and it's much larger than one of these little synaptic knobs. Can store tons of adrenaline. Now, when I have prolonged stress, I can switch from this system, exhausting my adrenaline sources, to this system, and then I can synapse directly onto the adrenal medulla, and then the adrenal medulla will dump tons of norepinephrine into the body. And once the norepinephrine is in the bloodstream, the adrenaline, it will go to all of these organs through our blood vessels and not have individual axons going to each one. So when we have short-term stress, our nervous system fires with synapses on all these organs and releases adrenaline and causes that global sympathetic fight or flight response. But if the stress becomes prolonged, we can switch from the nervous system to our endocrine system, and we can fire directly on the adrenal medulla. That's why they're called direct endocrine reflexes. The adrenal medulla will dump adrenaline into your bloodstream, and as it goes through your blood vessels, some of it will land here, some of it will land here, and it can hit all the organs from one single source. And that source can hold and produce and store a lot more adrenaline than all these little tiny synapses can turn it over. So then we can make it a lot longer to survive. Eventually this system will start to gas out, and then you go through what is called the exhaustion phase, and we went through some of that in part 1A and P, all right? So now, we have 4 pathways that hormones can pass through, okay? Quick synopsis, and then we'll start the videos where we go into all of these, okay? I'm going to draw the human brain here again. Here's the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary, okay? And then over here I'm going to have endocrine organ. I'm going to have several endocrine organs in this drawing. I'm going to have several targets, okay? Just bear with me. I want you to see this. Always the target cells are going to give us the response. Okay? In one system, in the simple pathway, the endocrine organ detects the stimulus, releases the hormone travels through the bloodstream, and binds to target cells. Okay? Now, in neuroendocrine reflexes, I'm going to have my hypothalamus detect the hormone, the cells extend into the posterior pituitary, The hormone goes directly to the target cells and gives us the response. In complex endocrine pathways, I have to have blood vessels that connect the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus, and then blood vessels connect from the hypothalamus to the endocrine organ, and then blood vessels that connect to the target cells. Okay? Multiple steps. So this is my releasing hormone from the cells in the hypothalamus. I didn't draw them in the hypothalamus, but you get the idea. And then cells in the anterior pituitary receive that, and they release the tropic hormone. The tropic hormone goes and binds to cells of another endocrine organ, and that endocrine organ is going to release a new hormone that's going to go to the target. Although there is an occasion where we'll skip this extra step. So now, you can see all four pathways next to each other. Simple endocrine reflexes don't even involve the brain in any way, shape, or form. The endocrine organ somewhere in the body detects the stimulus, releases a hormone, goes to the target, gives us the response. Neuroendocrine reflexes, the hypothalamus detects the stimulus, but the cells extend axons into the neurohypophysis or posterior pituitary and then release the hormone there. It goes to the target, gives us the response. Complex endocrine pathways, the hypothalamus detects the stimulus, the hypothalamus secretes a releasing hormone. The releasing hormone binds to cells in the anterior pituitary, they release a tropic hormone, and then the tropic hormone can go straight to the target, or in most instances it's going to bind to a third endocrine organ. That endocrine organ is going to release a third hormone, and then that goes to the target to give us the response. You can see why it's complex. It involves several steps. And then we have the direct neurostimulation. We're already done with this hormone. It's called adrenaline or norepinephrine. The stimulus is prolonged stress. The brain will synapse through neurons directly on the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla dumps norepinephrine into the bloodstream, and we get the global sympathetic response. Okay? So, those are the four endocrine pathways. Probably not the clearest explanation I've done of these. I've got such a small board, it's hard to squeeze it. I'm trying to squeeze so much in. I hope it made sense to you. Okay? Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the flip side. In the next endocrine video, we're going to actually start plugging hormones into this pathway. We're going to do all the hormones of the posterior pituitary, then I'll do all the hormones of the anterior pituitary, and then we'll do all the simple endocrine reflexes. We're already done with the one that involves the adrenal medulla and adrenaline. Got it? So 1 out of our 18 hormones is down. We only have 17 more to go. I hope you learned something. Hope you had as much fun as I did. See you on the flip side in the next video. Thanks for watching.